Welcome, weary traveller, to this journey through the annals of history. As the day's troubles fade and sleep's gentle embrace beckons, let us embark on a voyage to a time long past, a time of faith, fear, and fervour. To those just joining our little fireside chat, I bid you welcome. Wherever in the world you may be, from the sun-kissed shores of the Mediterranean to the misty moors of Scotland, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time with me. Whether it's the witching hour or the first light of dawn, I hope you'll find in these tales a pleasant companion to usher you into the realm of dreams. If you enjoy these quiet excursions into yesteryear, I invite you to subscribe and join our little fellowship of history lovers. We're a curious bunch, always eager to learn and ponder the twists and turns of the human story. But enough about us. Let us turn our gaze to the subject of tonight's tale. In the coming hour or so, we'll be delving into one of the most notorious and controversial chapters in the long and often tumultuous history of the Catholic Church, the medieval Inquisition. Spanning 6 centuries and multiple continents, the Inquisition was a powerful and much-feared institution that left an indelible mark on the Western world. At its helm were the Inquisitors, men tasked with rooting out heresy and preserving the purity of the Christian faith by any means necessary. But who were these enigmatic figures? What kind of lives did they lead, and what motivated them to take on such a daunting and often disturbing role? Were they righteous warriors for God, or sadistic tyrants drunk on power? As with most things in life, the truth lies somewhere in between. Through the mists of time, the Inquisitors have taken on an almost mythical quality, faceless spectres in dark robes, prowling the land for innocent souls to condemn. But behind the grim caricature were real men, each with his own story, struggles, and convictions. In our time together, we'll seek to understand these complex and controversial figures, to look beyond the lurid tales of torture and cruelty and catch a glimpse of the human beings beneath the hoods. We'll follow in their footsteps as they navigate a world of piety and persecution, faith and fanaticism. Along the way, we'll meet some of the most notorious inquisitors in history, from the overzealous Robert le Bourgh to the infamous Tomás de Torquemada. We'll explore the methods and motivations of the Inquisition and ponder some of the profound moral questions it raises about the nature of justice, belief, and human cruelty. So settle in, dear friend, and let the slow flame of knowledge light our way into the darkness of the distant past. Rest your weary head and listen to the tales of those who came before, whispered on the winds of time. Our story begins in the early 13th century, in the rolling hills and quiet villages of Languedoc, a region in what is now southern France. For centuries, this land had been a bastion of the Cathar faith, a Christian sect that rejected the authority of the Catholic Church and believed in a radically different interpretation of the Bible. To the Cathars, the material world was a corrupt prison created by an evil deity, while the spiritual realm was the domain of the true, good God. They saw the Catholic Church as a fraudulent institution that had strayed from the true teachings of Christ, and they sought to live simple, ascetic lives focused on spiritual purity. As the Cathars grew in number and influence, the Catholic authorities began to view them as a serious threat to the Church's power and unity. In 1209, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars, urging the nobles of northern France to take up arms against the heretics. The Albigensian Crusade, as it came to be known, was a brutal and bloody affair. For nearly 20 years, Catholic armies rampaged through Languedoc, laying siege to Cathar strongholds and slaughtering anyone suspected of heresy. By the time the last embers of resistance were extinguished in 1229, the once thriving Cathar culture had been all but wiped out. But even as the Crusaders sheathed their swords, the Church knew that the battle against heresy was far from over. The Cathars had been defeated militarily, but their ideas still lingered in the shadows, waiting to resurface. To stamp out these embers of dissent once and for all, the Church needed a new kind of weapon, one that could penetrate the hearts and minds of the faithful and root out heresy at its source. Thus, the Inquisition was born. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX issued a bull that granted special powers to church-appointed inquisitors, authorizing them to investigate and prosecute cases of heresy throughout Europe. These men, usually drawn from the Dominican and Franciscan monastic orders, were given broad authority to question suspects, gather evidence, and pass judgment on the accused. The early inquisitors were a zealous and uncompromising lot, driven by a burning desire to defend the faith and purge the world of what they saw as the scourge of heresy. One of the most notorious of these early inquisitors was a man named Robert le Bougre. Born in the early 13th century, Robert was himself a former Cathar who had renounced his heretical past and joined the Dominican order. As an inquisitor, he quickly gained a reputation for his ruthless methods and unwavering conviction in the righteousness of his cause. In 1233, Robert was appointed as an inquisitor for the region of Burgundy in eastern France. He wasted no time in launching a fierce campaign against suspected heretics, using torture and intimidation to extract confessions from his victims. One of Robert's favorite tactics was the water cure, a brutal form of waterboarding in which the accused was strapped to a bench, their mouth held open with a metal device, and water poured down their throat until they either confessed or drowned. Other times, he would use hot irons or thumbscrews to break the will of his prisoners. Robert's methods were so extreme that even some of his fellow inquisitors began to question his judgment. In one notorious case, he had a group of peasants in the village of Moisy arrested and tortured on suspicion of heresy, based on little more than rumours and hearsay. Under the weight of Robert's interrogation, the accused broke down and confessed to all manner of outlandish crimes, from flying through the air on broomsticks to having sexual relations with demons. Despite the obviously fantastical nature of these confessions, Robert used them as evidence to condemn the entire village to the flames. As the bonfire consumed the screaming bodies of men, women, and children, Robert looked on with grim satisfaction, convinced that he had struck a blow for God and purified the land of evil. But his zealotry had not gone unnoticed by his superiors in the church. In 1239, Robert was called before an ecclesiastical court to answer charges of abuse of power and excessive cruelty. The evidence against him was damning. Dozens of witnesses came forward to testify about his brutal methods and the innocent lives he had destroyed. Faced with the weight of his own sins, Robert broke down and confessed to his crimes. He was stripped of his office and sentenced to life imprisonment in a monastery, where he would spend the rest of his days in penance and prayer. The fall of Robert le Bougre sent shockwaves through the early Inquisition, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked zealotry and the corrupting influence of power. But despite this setback, the Inquisition would continue to grow and evolve over the coming centuries, becoming one of the most feared and powerful institutions in all of Christendom. As the 13th century gave way to the 14th, the Inquisition began to take on a more formalized and regulated structure. Inquisitors were given extensive training in theology, canon law, and the art of interrogation, equipping them with the tools they needed to carry out their sacred duty. The life of an inquisitor was not an easy one. Most were drawn from the ranks of the Dominican and Franciscan orders, men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They were expected to lead lives of austere simplicity, forsaking the comforts of home and family for the rigors of the road. Inquisitors were constantly on the move, traveling from town to town in search of heresy and corruption. They would often arrive unannounced, setting up their tribunal in the local church or town square and calling on the populace to come forward with any information about suspicious activities or beliefs. Life on the road was hard and fraught with danger. Inquisitors often faced hostility and resistance from local populations who resented their intrusion into their lives and feared their power. There were stories of inquisitors being attacked, robbed, or even murdered by angry mobs or vengeful heretics. Even when they weren't facing physical danger, the life of an inquisitor was one of constant hardship and sacrifice. They often traveled on foot or by mule, braving harsh weather and treacherous terrain. They slept in simple lodgings, often little more than a straw pallet on a stone floor, and ate meager meals of bread and gruel. But for all the hardships they endured, inquisitors were also granted significant privileges and authority. They answered only to the Pope himself and were immune from prosecution by local authorities. They had the power to summon witnesses, seize property, and pass judgment on the accused, a level of autonomy that was rare in the highly stratified society of medieval Europe. The inquisitorial process itself was a complex and highly regimented affair, governed by a strict set of rules and procedures. When an inquisitor arrived in a town, his first step was to announce the Edict of Faith, a public proclamation that called on all members of the community to come forward with any information about heretical activities. Informants were encouraged to denounce their neighbors, friends, and even family members, with the promise of anonymity and spiritual rewards for their cooperation. Those who failed to come forward faced excommunication and the threat of being denounced themselves. Once the inquisitor had gathered a list of suspects, the real work began. The accused were brought before the tribunal and subjected to intense questioning, often in the presence of a scribe who would record every word spoken. The interrogation process was designed to be both physically and psychologically grueling, with the aim of breaking down the suspect's resistance and extracting a confession. Inquisitors were trained in the art of verbal manipulation, using a variety of techniques to trick or coerce their subjects into admitting their guilt. If a suspect proved resistant to questioning, the inquisitor had a range of tools at his disposal to loosen their tongue. One common method was sleep deprivation, where the accused would be kept awake for days on end, subjected to constant questioning and haranguing until they finally cracked. Another favorite tactic was the use of leading questions, where the inquisitor would ask the suspect a series of carefully crafted questions that were designed to elicit a specific response. For example, an inquisitor might ask, "Did you attend a heretical meeting on the night of the full moon?" Even if there was no evidence to suggest such a meeting had taken place. If verbal trickery failed, the inquisitor could resort to more direct forms of coercion, such as torture. While the use of torture was officially regulated by church law, in practice, inquisitors had wide latitude to employ whatever methods they deemed necessary to extract a confession. The specific techniques used varied from region to region, but some of the most common included stretching the suspect on the rack, crushing their fingers with thumbscrews, or applying hot irons to sensitive parts of the body. Waterboarding, as we saw with Robert Le Bougre, was also a popular choice. The goal of torture was not necessarily to punish the suspect, but rather to break their will and force them to confess to their crimes. In the eyes of the inquisitors, a confession obtained under torture was just as valid as one given freely, as long as the suspect confirmed it again after the torture had ceased. Once a confession had been obtained, the inquisitor would pass judgment on the accused. The specific punishment varied depending on the severity of the crime and the level of contrition shown by the suspect. Minor offences might be punished with a period of penance or a fine, while more serious crimes could result in imprisonment, confiscation of property, or even death. The most severe punishment, reserved for unrepentant heretics, was to be relaxed to the secular authorities, which was a euphemism for being burned at the stake. The use of such brutal methods was justified by the Church as a necessary evil in the fight against heresy. Inquisitors were seen as holy warriors, engaged in a cosmic battle against the forces of darkness that threatened to engulf the world. In their minds, the suffering inflicted on the accused was a small price to pay for the salvation of their immortal souls. By forcing them to confess and repent, the Inquisitors believed they were actually showing mercy, sparing the heretics from the far worse torments of eternal damnation. But as the Inquisition grew in power and scope, it became increasingly clear that the lines between righteous zeal and sadistic cruelty were becoming blurred. The very success of the Inquisitors in rooting out heresy had created a climate of fear and paranoia where no one was above suspicion, and the slightest deviation from orthodoxy could lead to ruin. It was in this atmosphere of terror and intolerance that one of the most notorious figures in the history of the Inquisition would rise to power. His name was Tomás de Torquemada, and his legacy would come to define the Spanish Inquisition at its most brutal and oppressive. Born in 1420 in the Spanish city of Valladolid, Torquemada was the nephew of a prominent cardinal and a devout Catholic from an early age. He entered the Dominican order as a young man and quickly gained a reputation for his keen intellect and unwavering faith. In 1483, Torquemada was appointed as the first Inquisitor General of Spain, a position that gave him sweeping authority over the religious lives of the Spanish people. He wasted no time in using his new powers to launch a fierce campaign against heresy and religious dissent. One of Torquemada's primary targets was the large population of conversos in Spain, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Torquemada saw the conversos as a cancer on the body of Spanish society, a hidden threat that needed to be rooted out and destroyed. He instituted a series of harsh new measures designed to identify and punish those who were secretly clinging to their old beliefs. One of these measures was the Edict of Grace, a decree that offered a brief window of amnesty for conversos who voluntarily confessed to practicing Judaism or Islam in secret. Those who came forward would be spared the worst punishments, but would still face heavy fines, confiscation of property, and public humiliation. For those who failed to take advantage of the Edict of Grace, the consequences were dire. Torquemada's agents fanned out across Spain, raiding homes and synagogues, seizing property, and arresting anyone suspected of heresy. The accused were brought before the inquisitorial tribunals, where they faced intense interrogation and torture. Torquemada himself was known to take a personal interest in many cases, presiding over the questioning and even participating in the torture himself. Under Torquemada's reign, the Spanish Inquisition reached new heights of brutality and efficiency. The number of trials and executions skyrocketed, with thousands of people burned at the stake or imprisoned for life. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Torquemada created had a profound impact on Spanish society. Neighbor turned against neighbor, family members denounced each other, and even the slightest hint of unorthodoxy could lead to ruin. One of the most notorious examples of Torquemada's cruelty was the case of the Holy Child of La Guardia, a bizarre and tragic affair that would have far-reaching consequences for Spain's Jewish community. In 1490, a group of conversos in the town of La Guardia were accused of kidnapping a young Christian boy and subjecting him to a mock crucifixion in a blasphemous ritual. The accusation was based on the testimony of a single witness, a young girl who claimed to have seen the crime take place. Despite the lack of evidence, Torquemada latched onto the case as proof of the perfidy of the conversos. He had the accused arrested and subjected to brutal torture, extracting confessions that were later used to justify a wave of anti-Jewish violence across Spain. In the end, the Holy Child of La Guardia was revealed to be a complete fabrication. The young boy had never existed, and the entire story had been invented by Torquemada's agents to stir up anti-Semitic sentiment. But by then, the damage had been done. The case had helped to pave the way for the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, a catastrophic event that saw hundreds of thousands of people forced to flee their homes and abandon their property. The expulsion was the crowning achievement of Torquemada's career, the culmination of his lifelong obsession with religious purity, but it was also a sign of the growing power and influence of the Inquisition and the terrible toll that it was taking on Spanish society. As the years passed, Torquemada's iron grip on the Inquisition only tightened. He became increasingly paranoid and suspicious, seeing enemies and... As the sun set on another day of brutality, the aged Inquisitor knelt before the cross in his Spartan quarters. The screams of the condemned still echoed in his mind. He had long ago lost count of the confessions he had extracted, the torments he had inflicted, the pyres he had lit. In his youth, he had believed fiercely in his holy mission, certain that each heretic he purged from the earth brought mankind closer to salvation. But decades of ceaseless persecution had sown doubts in his soul. When had he begun to question the righteousness of his work? Was it the pleading sobs of that young mother as she was ripped from her child's arms, condemned for the crime of ministering to lepers? The anguished wails of the old scholar as his precious books, the labor of a lifetime, were consigned to the flames? Or the stoic dignity of that accused witch, her white hair matted with blood, calmly forgiving her torturers, even as the flames consumed her? He had told himself that the devil was cunning, able to mask himself in beauty and virtue, that the momentary suffering of the body was nothing compared to the eternal agony of a corrupted soul, that the Inquisition's grim work was a sacred necessity. So how had he come to feel more kinship with the hapless men and women sobbing in his dungeons than the implacable brethren who sat in judgment beside him? Perhaps it was the creeping awareness that the church he served was all too human, prey to the same pettiness, greed, and jealousies as any institution of man. He had seen tribunal seats bought with gilded bribes, inquisitors jockeying for power and appointments, heresy charges wielded as weapons in familial feuds and business rivalries. Men of true faith seemed rarer each year, lost in a sea of cynical clerics and scheming courtiers. Or perhaps, in the twilight of his life, he was simply weary of cruelty, his once blazing conviction reduced to ashes. He had sought to save men's eternal souls, but increasingly he asked himself, at what cost? What if the price of a world without heresy was the slow poisoning of their own humanity? Were their hearts not also hardened and tainted by the horrors they inflicted? He had seen too many of his fellows grow to relish suffering, their eyes alight with perverse glee at the splintering of bone and sizzling of flesh. Some, like the infamous Torquemada, seemed to have shed all traces of conscience or compassion. It seemed to the aged Inquisitor that the Inquisition, in its relentless quest to purge the rot from Christendom, had instead spread a more insidious decay, a corrosion of mercy, empathy, and love. He bitterly wondered if, for all the blood they had spilled and terror they had sown, the world was further now from God than when they began. And yet, he could not simply renounce his life's work, undo the habits of decades. He still fervently believed in the teachings of Christ and Holy Mother Church. If he had been wrong, did that not invalidate his entire existence? What did it mean for his immortal soul if the acts he had built his life and identity around were not holy justice, but monstrous sin? So he persisted in his duties, even as each interrogation chipped away another piece of his certainty, of his increasingly fragile faith in the righteousness of his calling. He prayed that history would not judge him too harshly, even as part of him whispered that perhaps he deserved harsh judgment. He carried out his tasks by rote, a hollow husk of the fiery youth he had been, doubting if he could even feel the warmth of God's light or love anymore. As old age and infirmity crept upon him, he withdrew from public tribunals and turned over the grimmer work to younger subordinates, men whose zeal he recognized as akin to his own early fervor. Let them bear the weight of those screams and pleading eyes. His focus narrowed to the scholarship he had neglected too long, poring over arcane texts and theological debates. Even the most obscure doctrinal minutiae now seemed cleaner and purer than the bloody travesty the Inquisition had become in the waking world. At last, the once implacable Inquisitor simply faded from public view, the feared man becoming a ghostly enigma even to his brethren. Some said he had retired to a remote monastery to write his memoirs and atone for his sins. Others whispered that he had been silenced by rivals in the church hierarchy, his faltering convictions seen as a liability. Still others swore he had secretly fled to a heretical sect himself, broken by his role in the Inquisition's horrors. But perhaps the truth was simpler and sadder. A man who had given his life to a cause, now doubting if that cause had been worth the cost, and knowing he could never wash the blood from his hands regardless. The Inquisitor whose name had once made men tremble now passed from the earth in obscurity, awaking each night from dreams in which it was he who burned eternally for his sins. A life begun in the bright flame of faith and the iron certainty of justice had guttered out in ashes and regret. And yet, even as one weary soul bowed under the weight of doubt and guilt, the machinery of the Inquisition ground on, a bureaucracy and ideology too entrenched to be uprooted by the scruples of one man. As a new generation of zealots took up the Inquisitor's mantle, the dense lattice of spies, informants, and propagandists spread further, the definitions of heresy expanding to ensnare more hapless victims. The Inquisition had become an institution unto itself, one that would not be tamed for centuries yet to come. Though the aged Inquisitor's tale illustrated the psychological toll the Inquisition exacted on those caught up in its gears, the remorseful reflections of one man paled before the industrial scale of dehumanization and injustice the institution had come to represent by the dawn of the 16th century. Even as visionary figures of the Renaissance ushered in an age of humanism and rediscovery of classical knowledge, the Inquisitors continued their grim work, a medieval shadow stretching into the early modern world. It would take a cataclysm on the scale of the Protestant Reformation to truly shake the foundations of the Inquisition and the Church that had deployed it for so long as a bludgeon against dissent. As the 16th century dawned, Christendom found itself riven by a theological uprising that would shatter its unity and undermine the moral authority that institutions like the Inquisition depended on. But the ideas of visionaries like Martin Luther also drew upon undercurrents of resentment against ecclesiastical corruption and brutality that the Inquisition's bloody legacy had long nurtured. Even as the Protestant tide surged across Europe, however, the Inquisition redoubled its crackdowns, finding common cause with the secular forces of the Counter-Reformation in an all-out assault on religious nonconformity. In some regions, such as Torquemada's Spain, it even expanded its reach and power, becoming a dreaded tool of social control and enforced national unity. Hundreds of thousands would suffer in dungeons and burn at the stake before the Inquisition finally went into slow decline in the 17th and 18th centuries. But even as the auto da fe became a rarer sight in the public squares, replaced by the spectacle of the Enlightenment salon, the impact of the Inquisition's long reign could still be felt, woven into the fabric of European law, politics, and psychology. Across a continent that now enshrined individual liberty and freedom of thought as Enlightenment ideals, a culture of surveillance, enforced conformity, and guilt by suspicion lingered. The shadow of neighbour informing on neighbour, children testifying against parents. So perhaps it is fitting that the Inquisition did not die in a defining instant, but faded slowly over generations, its power chipped away by the shifting tides of history. Even as Napoleon's armies formally abolished the last tribunals in the early 1800s, Everywhere that suspicion was wielded as a weapon, torture extracted truth, and dissent was met with persecution. Its spirit endured. Like the aged inquisitor haunted by his deeds, Europe could not simply close the book on the Inquisition, for the wounds it had inflicted and the attitudes it had shaped ran too deep. Indeed, some of the Inquisition's most pernicious ideological descendants would not fully emerge until the 20th century, when the techniques of oppression and thought control it pioneered were revived by the totalitarian police states that convulse the modern age. The Inquisition's marriage of religious dogma and a ruthlessly efficient bureaucracy foreshadowed the terrors of Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Third Reich. Its nightly disappearances and muffled screams echoed in the gulags and concentration camps. And so we wrestle still with the Inquisition's legacy, the knowledge that humanity is capable of inflicting such systematic cruelty in the name of a higher cause. The Inquisitors, from the remorseful to the fanatical, loom as dark mirrors for the potential in all of us to justify abuse of power, to rationalize the suffering of others. In the sobering light of history, the once faceless functionaries of the Inquisition resolve into human beings, flawed, complex, often deeply conflicted figures, whose lives offer enduring warnings about the perils of moral certainty and the seductive draw of ideology. But perhaps, in our shared human frailty, we may also recognize the seeds of empathy and conscience that sometimes flickered even in the most ruthless inquisitor's heart. In striving to understand the choices and psychology of history's villains, we remind ourselves that no one is beyond the reach of doubt and self-reflection. The Inquisition's grim chronicle is shot through with subversive moments of humanity, as individuals questioned, resisted, and bore witness to the evil of the institution, even from within. These moments, however fleeting, are threads of light in a tapestry of terror. They remind us that just as no one is immune to being swept up in tides of fanaticism and hate, so too do we all possess the capacity to be moral actors, to listen to the stirrings of conscience. The Inquisition was a system engineered to stamp out independent thought and reduce human beings to cogs in a machine. Yet the defiant compassion and integrity of some of those cogs, however stifled, could never be wholly snuffed out. And therein may lie a strange, tenuous hope. If the Inquisition represents the worst of what human beings can be, our pettiness, our cruelty, our ability to dehumanize others, then the glimmers of conscience that persisted even in that darkness represent the best of what we can become. In the small, often tragic acts of mercy and moral courage that punctuate the Inquisition's history, we see the potential for empathy to assert itself even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. So let us remember the Inquisition not just as an abstracted symbol of religious fanaticism and intolerance, but as a chapter of human history, written by countless individuals, each navigating their own ethical minefields, each capable of base cruelty and transcendent compassion. In studying their lives and choices, we reckon not just with the darkest recesses of human nature, but with the persistent spark of our shared humanity. The Inquisition's legacy is one of institutionalized brutality on a terrifying scale. But it is also the secret legacy of those who listened to their hearts when dogma demanded otherwise, who planted seeds of kindness and doubt in a landscape of merciless certainty. If we today can muster half their moral courage in standing against cruelty and injustice in our own time, then perhaps even the Inquisition's long nightmare will not have been in vain. The Inquisitors' lives may serve as cautionary tales, but they also stand as testament that no system of oppression is so absolute that it can extinguish the human capacity for good. In wrestling with their stories, we keep alive the vital tension between our worst impulses and our best selves. We remember how fragile the illusions of righteousness can be, and how even the most rigid dogma must ultimately yield before the persistent stirrings of conscience and fellow feeling. Content warning. This script contains references to torture and religious persecution. The Spanish Inquisition reached its horrifying zenith under the iron fist of Inquisitor General Tomás de Torquemada in the late 15th century. Torquemada was a man of unwavering faith and merciless devotion to the cause of religious conformity. Under his methodical rule, the Inquisition in Spain took on a scale and brutality unseen in earlier Inquisitions. Tomás de Torquemada was born in 1420 into a family of conversos, Jews, who had converted to Catholicism, some out of genuine faith, others under the pressure of increasing anti-Semitism. As a young man, Torquemada joined the zealous Dominican order of monks and rose to become the confessor and advisor to Princess Isabella of Castile. When Isabella became queen in 1474 and married King Ferdinand of Aragon, together known as the Catholic monarchs, Torquemada gained immense influence over the royal couple's religious policies. In 1483, at Torquemada's urging, the Pope granted permission to reorganize and expand the Inquisition in Spain. Torquemada was appointed Inquisitor General of Castile, Aragon, and all Spanish territories, giving him unprecedented authority. No one, not even bishops, was immune to investigation for heresy under the new Holy Office of the Inquisition. Torquemada centralized operations, creating 4 regional tribunals and procedures for evidence gathering, interrogation, sentencing, and execution. Previously, Spanish Jews and Muslims had been tolerated, allowed to practice their faiths openly. Many had converted to Catholicism over the centuries to escape persecution, and these conversos had risen to important positions in the church, government, and economy. But their success bred resentment, and Torquemada saw conversos as a menace needing to be rooted out. Claiming conversos were secretly practicing Judaism or Islam, thereby undermining the Catholic faith, Torquemada made them his primary target. Under the guise of protecting the purity of the church, Torquemada unleashed a reign of terror across Spain. Inquisitors under his command swept through villages like a plague, ferreting out any behavior that could possibly be a sign of false conversion. Not eating pork, bathing on a Friday, lighting candles at dusk. Any slight deviation from Catholic norms could raise suspicion. Accused heretics were rounded up and subjected to horrific tortures to extract confessions. Waterboarding, stretching on the rack, crushing under heavy stones. The Inquisition had used torture before, but never so widely and wantonly. Those who confessed, if they were lucky, faced penalties like public humiliation, seizure of property, or imprisonment. Many more were burned alive at the stake in grand public spectacles, their anguished screams echoing through crowded town squares as flames devoured their flesh. An estimated 2,000 conversos met this gruesome fate during Torquemada's tenure. Thousands more fled Spain rather than live in constant dread of the Inquisitors' knock on the door. Tomás de Torquemada pursued his crusade against heresy with a cold, systematic efficiency that made him the most feared man in Spain. Even the Pope rebuked him for excessive cruelty, but he was undeterred. Torquemada saw himself not as a heartless killer, but a savior of Christian souls, willing to take on the hard, bloody work of spiritual purification. In his zeal, empathy was a luxury he could not afford. The psychological burden borne by inquisitors was immense, and some were crushed under its weight. While monsters like Torquemada seemed to revel in the power and violence, many inquisitors were haunted men, riven by doubt and guilt over the suffering they had caused in the name of defending the faith. Even in old age, inquisitors grappled with whether their legacy was one of righteousness or monstrosity. A young priest who served as an assistant to Torquemada later wrote of his time with the infamous Inquisitor General. In quiet moments, I saw a flicker of regret ghost across his face, as if the screams of the damned echoed in his mind. He would quickly snap back to his stony countenance, for doubt was the indulgence he could never show, lest it be seen as weakness. I pitied him then, for his unwavering conviction had turned his soul into a fortress no light could penetrate. Under Torquemada's 15-year reign as the Grand Inquisitor, the Spanish Inquisition metastasized into a monstrous force permeating every aspect of society. An estimated 150,000 people were charged with heresy, and around 5,000 were executed. Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, under threat of death, scattering an entire community to the winds. Muslims met a similar fate in the early 1500s. Spain was ethnically and religiously purified, but at the cost of immeasurable human suffering. The Inquisition was the original surveillance state, an institution that made spying and snitching on one's neighbours a virtue and moral imperative. It was neighbour turning against neighbour, tearing apart the fabric of community and trust. The Spanish Inquisition became the archetype of the Inquisition's cruelty, a symbol of the dangers of absolute power wedded to fanatical conviction. It reached an intensity of persecution and violence unmatched by the Church before or after. Later Inquisitions in Italy, Portugal, and the New World, while brutal in their own ways, did not match the pace and scale of torture and execution that Torquemada brought to Spain. Ironically, the efficiency and brutality that Torquemada instilled in the Spanish Inquisition planted the seeds of the Inquisition's downfall. The sheer scale of the persecutions under Torquemada and his immediate successors began to draw backlash and scrutiny. Critics condemned the Inquisition's methods as un-Christian. Continued religious splintering after the Protestant Reformation eroded the Church's authority. Enlightenment ideals of personal liberty and freedom of thought sparked revulsion against the Inquisition's cruelty and censorship. The last remnants of the Spanish Inquisition were not officially abolished until 1834. For over 600 years, the Inquisition cast a shadow of terror across Europe and beyond. Untold multitudes suffered and died at the hands of the Church's ruthless heresy hunters. At its height, under Tomás de Torquemada, the Spanish Inquisition in particular demonstrated how all-consuming ideology, unchecked power, and the suppression of dissent could birth unimaginable brutality. Even those who carried out that brutality often paid a psychological price. Yet, for all the terror they sowed, most inquisitors did not see themselves as evil men. In a time when eternal damnation was not an abstract concept, but a visceral fear, people believed the Church's spiritual authority must be defended at any cost. The tragedy is that in their crusade to save souls, inquisitors so often lost sight of their own humanity. We recoil in horror today at the torture and religious persecution committed by the Inquisition. It is held up as the epitome of human cruelty and intolerance, one of history's darkest chapters. Yet the Inquisitors were not uniquely evil or sadistic, but ordinary men corrupted by a toxic combination of power, zealotry, and moral certainty. As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Perhaps the enduring lesson of the Inquisition is to be wary of any ideology or institution that believes it has a monopoly on truth or goodness, and that even our deepest convictions must be tempered by compassion, lest we become the monsters we thought we were fighting against. The human capacity for cruelty in the name of a higher cause is something we must always guard against. The story of the Inquisition and the twisted psyches of the men who powered its machinery of death is ultimately a warning and a mirror. As the aged inquisitor sat in his chamber, reflecting on a long and tumultuous career, his mind drifted to the countless interrogations, trials, and punishments he had overseen. He remembered the faces of the accused, men, women, and even children, their eyes wide with fear as they were dragged before the tribunal. He recalled the screams of agony that echoed through the torture chambers, the sickening smell of burning flesh from the auto da fe. For decades, he had been a loyal servant of the church, a defender of the faith against the insidious threat of heresy. He had truly believed that his work was righteous, that every confession extracted, every sentence handed down, was necessary to preserve the integrity of Christendom. But now, in the twilight of his life, doubt crept into his mind like a thief in the night. Had he been too zealous, too quick to judge and condemn? Were all those who had perished at his command truly guilty, or were they simply victims of a system that valued conformity over compassion? He thought of the families torn apart, the lives ruined, the communities living in constant fear of denunciation and persecution. The Inquisitor's hands trembled as he lifted a quill and began to write, pouring his troubled thoughts onto the page. He knew that his words would likely never be read, that the church would prefer his doubts and regrets remain hidden. But he felt a need to confess, to seek some form of absolution for the role he had played in this brutal machine. As his quill scratched across the parchment, he wondered how history would remember him and his fellow Inquisitors. Would they be seen as righteous defenders of the faith or as cruel fanatics who had abused their power? Only time would tell. The Inquisitor's story was not unique. Across Europe, as the Inquisition's grip began to loosen in the face of social and political change, many of its former agents found themselves grappling with similar questions and doubts. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century had dealt a severe blow to the power and prestige of the Catholic Church. As new religious ideas spread like wildfire, the Inquisition found itself increasingly on the defensive, struggling to maintain its relevance in a rapidly changing world. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Enlightenment brought a new emphasis on reason, individual rights, and religious tolerance. Philosophers and writers like Voltaire and Montesquieu fiercely criticized the Inquisition, portraying it as a barbaric relic of a bygone age. Public opinion began to turn against the institution, seeing it as a symbol of the Church's worst excesses and abuses. Faced with this rising tide of opposition, the Inquisition gradually lost its power and influence. Its methods were increasingly seen as inhumane and unjust, its claims to authority challenged by a more skeptical and secular society. By the late 18th century, the Inquisition had largely ceased to function in most of Europe, though it lingered on in some regions until the early 19th century. The formal abolishment of the Inquisition came in stages. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte abolished the Inquisition in Spain and its colonies, seeing it as an obstacle to his imperial ambitions. Other countries followed suit over the next few decades, with the Papal States finally dissolving the Roman Inquisition in 1860. But even as the institution faded into history, its legacy continued to cast a long shadow. Over the course of its nearly 600-year lifespan, the Inquisition had been responsible for the torture, imprisonment, and execution of countless individuals across Europe and the Americas. Some estimates put the total number of people tried by the Inquisition at around 150,000, with at least 3,000 to 5,000 executed, though the true numbers are likely far higher. Beyond the sheer scale of human suffering, the Inquisition had also left a deep psychological scar on Western society. It had fostered a culture of suspicion, paranoia, and intolerance, encouraging people to betray their neighbors and loved ones in the name of religious conformity. It had stifled free thought and intellectual inquiry, creating an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship that would take centuries to fully dissipate. In many ways, the Inquisition can be seen as a precursor to the totalitarian police states of the 20th century, with its use of surveillance, denunciation, and terror to maintain control over the population. Its methods of interrogation and torture honed over centuries, would be studied and adapted by modern regimes seeking to crush dissent and extract confessions. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Inquisition's legacy is what it reveals about human nature itself. How could so many seemingly pious and educated men have convinced themselves that brutalizing their fellow human beings was not only justified, but morally necessary? What does it say about the human capacity for cruelty and self-deception that the Inquisition could have persisted for so long, with so much support from the highest levels of society? As the aged Inquisitor pondered these questions in his final days, he knew that there were no easy answers. The Inquisition had been a product of its time, shaped by complex social, political, and religious forces that could not be reduced to simple explanations of good and evil. Many of its agents, like himself, had undoubtedly believed that they were doing God's work, even as their actions brought untold suffering to countless innocents. And yet, he also knew that belief alone could not excuse the Inquisition's crimes. Whatever their motivations, the men who had wielded its power had ultimately been responsible for their own choices and actions. They had allowed themselves to be seduced by the allure of power and certainty, to see those who differed from them not as fellow children of God, but as enemies to be destroyed. As the Inquisitor set down his quill and gazed out the window at the setting sun, he offered a silent prayer for the souls of all those who had suffered under the Inquisition's long and brutal reign. He knew that the institution he had served for so long would be judged harshly by history, and perhaps rightly so. But he also hoped that future generations would learn from the Inquisition's example, that they would recognize the dangers of fanaticism and the importance of compassion and understanding. For in the end, the Inquisitor realized, it was not the grand sweep of history that mattered most, but the countless individual lives that had been touched by its cruel hand. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the Inquisitor's chamber grew dark, he closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to the faces of those he had encountered over the years, the frightened and the defiant, the guilty and the innocent. He knew that their stories would haunt him until the end of his days, a reminder of the terrible power he had wielded and the heavy price that had been paid. And yet, even in the depths of his sorrow and regret, the Inquisitor found a small measure of hope. For if he, a man who had once been so certain of his righteousness, could come to question his actions and seek forgiveness, then perhaps there was still a chance for humanity to learn from its mistakes and build a better, more just world. It is a lesson that echoes through the centuries, a reminder that even the darkest chapters of our history hold within them the seeds of redemption and renewal. As we look back on the long and brutal reign of the Inquisition, let us honor the memory of those who suffered under its yoke by striving to create a society built on empathy, understanding, and respect for the fundamental dignity of every human being. For only by confronting the shadows of our past can we hope to build a brighter future, one in which the fires of intolerance and persecution are finally extinguished, and the light of compassion and justice is allowed to shine forth. It is a future that the aged Inquisitor, in his final moments of reflection, dared to imagine, and one that we must all work tirelessly to bring about. As we've seen, the life of an Inquisitor in medieval times was far from easy or enviable. These men, often drawn from monastic orders like the Dominicans and Franciscans, faced a grueling existence in service of their brutal cause. Becoming an Inquisitor required extensive training in theology and law, equipping them to identify and prosecute heresy in all its supposed forms. Only the sharpest minds and most fervent believers were selected for the task. Most were driven by a sincere conviction that they were doing God's work in rooting out the cancer of unbelief from medieval society. Others perhaps were motivated more by the power and prestige of the position. Once appointed, an Inquisitor's life was one of constant travel and danger as they roamed from town to town, region to region, seeking out whispers of heresy. whereas the bishops and abbots of the church often enjoyed lavish residences and entourages. The inquisitors' accommodations were simple and sparse. They often stayed in humble lodgings provided by local monasteries or churches, their few personal possessions contained in a small chest. When arriving in a new town, the inquisitor would announce his presence and call upon the local authorities to support his investigations. He might begin by preaching a sermon against heresy, outlining the grave danger it posed to the souls of the community. Then the real work would begin. Inquisitors had broad authority to gather evidence and call witnesses in their hunt for heretics. They employed a variety of methods, from offering lenience to those who confessed and informed on their brethren, to outright intimidation and torture. The entire apparatus of the Inquisition was designed to instill a deep sense of fear and paranoia, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. One can only imagine the heavy psychological toll this work took on the inquisitors themselves. To spend one's days steeped in suspicion, constantly on guard for the slightest hint of impiety or unbelief. To sit in judgment over terrified men, women, and even children, employing whatever means necessary to extract a confession, and then to condemn the unrepentant to a brutal death, all while believing you were carrying out divine justice. It's no wonder many inquisitors were said to be dour, haunted men, weighed down by the burden of their office. And yet, for all the hardship and moral peril they faced, the inquisitors wielded immense power within medieval society. With a word, they could have someone arrested and jailed, their property and possessions seized. They answered to no authority but the Pope himself, and even local bishops and kings were hesitant to interfere in their activities, lest they be seen as sympathizers to heresy. This unchecked power, combined with the climate of fear and paranoia surrounding heresy, made abuse and excess almost inevitable. While many inquisitors may have earnestly believed they were doing righteous work, the structure of the Inquisition was ripe for exploitation by sadists and power-hungry opportunists. The Spanish Inquisition of the late 15th century saw this toxic mix reach its full, terrible potential under the infamous Tomás de Torquemada. A Dominican friar of Converso heritage, Torquemada rose to become the first Inquisitor General of Spain, a position of immense power that he wielded with ruthless efficiency. Torquemada's single-minded obsession with rooting out heresy, particularly among conversos suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, would make him one of the most feared and reviled figures in Spanish history. Under his leadership, the Inquisition became a machine of terror, torture, and death, casting a shadow over the lives of thousands. But the story of Torquemada and the Spanish Inquisition he built is one that deserves its own telling. For now, suffice to say that the seeds of his brutality were planted long before, in the fear, power, and righteousness that defined the Inquisitor's life in medieval times. These men, for all their learning and conviction, sowed the wind of intolerance and left a bitter harvest for generations to reap. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern period, the power of the Inquisition would gradually wane. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century dealt a heavy blow to the Catholic Church's authority, as did the spread of Enlightenment ideals of religious tolerance and freedom of thought in the centuries that followed. By the time the Spanish Inquisition was finally abolished in 1834, the world had largely turned against the idea of such overt religious persecution. And yet, the Inquisition's centuries-long reign of terror left an indelible mark on Western history and culture. Its legacy can be seen in the formation of modern police states and surveillance apparatus, in the tactics of intimidation and coercion still employed by authoritarian regimes. And its memory lives on as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism and unchecked power. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Inquisition is the complexity and moral ambiguity that haunts even the darkest chapters of human history. For as much as we may rightly condemn the cruelty and injustice perpetrated by the Inquisitors, we must also remember that they were human beings, driven by a mix of faith, fear, and fallibility. In studying their brutal lives and trying to understand their motivations, we hold up a mirror to the ugliest potentials within ourselves. And in recognizing the humanity behind even the most inhuman acts, we take a step towards the empathy and understanding that is the only true antidote to intolerance. As we close this chapter on the brutal lives of Inquisitors in medieval times, let us reflect on what their story can teach us about the perils of certainty and the necessity of compassion. For in the end, it is not the grand sweep of history, but the small, everyday choices of individuals that shape the world we live in. The Inquisitors may have believed they were serving a higher truth, but in the light of history, their legacy is one of suffering and sorrow. May we learn from their mistakes and strive always to temper our convictions with humility and our justice with mercy. For only then can we hope to build a world where the horrors of the Inquisition remain firmly in the past, never to be repeated. And with that, we come to the end of our dark journey through the brutal lives of medieval Inquisitors. I hope this exploration has been as enlightening as it has been sobering, and that the heavy weight of history will soon give way to the restful peace of sleep. Until next time, this is your faithful historian, bidding you good night. As the apparatus of the Inquisition spread across Spain, Torquemada appointed subordinates and deputies to expand his reach to every corner of the realm. Inquisitorial courts were established in major cities like Barcelona, Seville, Córdoba, and Zaragoza. Each tribunal was staffed by 2 inquisitors, a prosecutor, theologians, and familiars or informants who acted as the eyes and ears of the Inquisition among the populace. Steadily, Torquemada crafted an intricate network of spies, officials, and religious zealots utterly devoted to the mission of uncovering heresy. The tentacles of the Inquisition wrapped themselves around all levels of Spanish society, from lowly peasants to the halls of royal power. A palpable sense of dread and paranoia seeped into everyday interactions. Servants informed on masters, neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, and parents lived in fear that innocent remarks by children could bring the Inquisitor to their door. One contemporary chronicler described the oppressive atmosphere that pervaded Spain, writing, "There was no one, however faultless and innocent, who was not exposed at every moment to the blows of secret and domestic treason." It was enough to have an enemy, to be pointed out by the finger of an imprudent person, in order to be arrested, ruined, lost, without defense, without any protection whatsoever. Torquemada himself was a tireless crusader, constantly on the move between the various tribunals to oversee trials and stoke the fires of intolerance. He draped himself in an austere black Dominican habit and rode from town to town on a donkey, cultivating an image of pious humility, even as he wielded terrifying power over the lives of thousands. Despite his unassuming appearance, Torquemada lived like a prince of the church, holding court in lavish apartments within the Alhambra Palace in Granada. There he dined on rich dishes and rare delicacies prepared by his own chefs, a privilege granted by his patron Queen Isabella. He slept in ornate chambers hung with fine tapestries depicting the lives of the saints. Each morning, he celebrated a private mass on a golden altar before a jeweled reliquary said to contain a fragment of the true cross. From this gilded stronghold, Torquemada directed the escalating persecution with a methodical yet unhinged zeal. His letters and edicts to subordinates pulsed with apocalyptic language about demonic forces threatening the fabric of Christian society. He spoke of the divine mandate to preserve the purity of the faith at any cost, writing, "It is necessary for us to ravage and exterminate the enemies of God from the face of the earth, that his holy name be everywhere honored by the lips of the faithful." Under Torquemada's leadership, the Spanish Inquisition reached new heights of ruthless efficiency and standardization. His deputies employed an assembly line approach to processing the accused, moving them swiftly from interrogation to imprisonment, to the final macabre spectacle of the auto da fe. Detailed records were kept of each case, from the initial charges to the eventual verdict and sentence. These meticulous documents, with notes on the prisoner's background and the minutiae of their confessions, reveal the relentless bureaucracy of persecution perfected by Torquemada. One can imagine the Inquisitor General poring over these registers late into the night, a thin smile playing on his lips, intoxicated by the knowledge and power they represented. As the years ground on, the autos da fe grew in scale and frequency, becoming darkly festive occasions attended by thousands. In Toledo, the central square was transformed into a towering theatre of horror, with raised platforms for nobility and towering stagings where the condemned met their fate before mobs howling for blood. The king and queen often presided over these grim spectacles, lending the weight of royal authority to the proceedings. Torquemada took to granting indulgences to those who brought wood for the pyres, turning average citizens into collaborators in the machinery of death. Rich and poor alike vied for the honor of fueling the flames, believing it would ease their way into heaven. At one notorious auto da fe in Seville in 1481, over 700 people were put to the torch in a single day. The stench of charred flesh hung over the city for weeks, a smoky reminder of the price of defying the Inquisition. Similar atrocities played out in Zaragoza, Barcelona, and Valladolid, where hundreds more heretics and backsliders were consigned to the flames. It's estimated that during Torquemada's 15-year tenure as Inquisitor General, around 2,000 people were burned at the stake. Another 9,000 suffered penalties such as imprisonment, exile, or crippling fines that left them destitute. But mere statistics fail to capture the individual human dramas and tragedies that played out before the Inquisition's tribunals. Consider the story of Andrés González, a 70-year-old converso in Toledo accused by neighbors of abstaining from pork and changing his linens on Fridays. Suspicious signs of crypto-Judaism. González was arrested and repeatedly tortured, stretched out on the rack until his aged joints cracked and popped. Through his shrieks of agony, the inquisitors demanded he confess to Judaizing and divulge the names of other secret Jews. Stripped naked and shivering, González continued to weakly profess his Christian faith. In a final effort to break his will, the inquisitors bound his head in a metal band and tightened it until it crushed his skull. At last, in a froth of blood and spittle, González broke down and told the inquisitors what they wanted to hear, condemning himself and a dozen other conversos to the stake. Or ponder the anguish of Maria Lopez, a young mother also accused of secret Judaism in Barcelona. Arrested and torn from her wailing infant son, Maria languished in the dungeons of the Inquisition for months, subject to the same cycle of threats, torture, and psychological manipulation. Starved and near senseless with suffering, she finally confessed to observing Jewish rituals, sealing her death sentence. As she was paraded before the jeering crowds at her auto da fe, dressed in a pitiful penitent's robe, she suddenly caught sight of her baby boy in the arms of a relative. Letting out a piercing wail, Maria tried to rush towards him, only to be restrained by her guards who beat her into submission. Spluttering blood and teeth, she continued to scream for her son as she was tied to the stake. While the flames consumed her, she fixed her unblinking gaze on the infant until the end, as if trying to absorb a final image of him to carry into the abyss. These terrible scenes played out again and again across Spain, each case a unique tapestry of misery inflicted in the name of religious purity. Anguish and dread became woven into the very fabric of daily life, a shadow of fear cast by the ever-present threat of the Inquisition. The aftershocks of each auto da fe rippled out through the cities and towns of Castile and Aragon. The children and relatives of the condemned were left destitute, ostracized by a society that now viewed them as the offspring of the impure. Many had to wear special insignia marking them as the descendants of heretics. Denied access to guilds, universities, and public office, they eked out a marginal existence. Some converso families tried desperately to flee Spain, liquidating their property and booking secret passage to more tolerant lands like the Ottoman Empire. But Torquemada's agents were watching the ports and roads, arresting anyone suspected of trying to escape the Inquisition's clutches. Other conversos burrowed into Spanish society, striving to efface any lingering traces of their Jewish or Muslim ancestry. They became avid participants in Catholic rituals, ostentatiously eating pork at every occasion, and sometimes even volunteering to spy for the Inquisition to deflect suspicion from themselves. Crypto-Judaism was steadily scoured from Spain, replaced by a uniquely Spanish breed of Catholicism, defined by its very opposition to the country's Semitic past. Through it all, Torquemada was the looming architect of the Terror, a spectral figure cloaked in the mists of sanctimony and sadism. As the years ticked by and his power grew ever more absolute, he became increasingly paranoid and embittered. The weight of the thousands of broken bodies and snuffed-out lives seemed to press down on Torquemada's hunched shoulders. He took to wearing a coat of mail beneath his Dominican robes, obsessed with the idea that converso assassins lurked around every corner. By night, he paced the halls of his chambers in the Alhambra, muttering prayers and fingering the heavy gold cross around his neck as if for protection. Even as his physical health deteriorated and his eyes grew rheumy with age, Torquemada's stranglehold on the Spanish soul only intensified. In his final years, he used his influence to lobby for the complete expulsion of Spain's remaining unconverted Jewish population, nearly 200,000 people who had lived in the country for centuries. On March 31st, 1492, mere months before Columbus embarked on his fateful journey, the Alhambra decree was issued, giving Spain's Jews a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or leave forever. The text of the edict was said to have been drafted by Torquemada himself, the apotheosis of his life's work to purge Spain of religious minorities. Tens of thousands of Sephardic Jews streamed out of the country, headed for an uncertain future in foreign lands. They locked the doors of ancient synagogues and abandoned ancestral homes, some said to still have the indentations of mezuzahs on their doorposts. The exiles took with them the keys to these forsaken abodes, vowing to someday return and unlock what had been lost. As the deadline for expulsion passed, the remaining Jews who refused to convert were rounded up and publicly humiliated, shorn of their beards and phylacteries. Many were eventually herded onto ships bound for North Africa or the Levant, cast out of the land their ancestors had called home for 1,500 years. Weakened and riven by plague, starvation and persecution, up to a third of the exiled Jews died on the journey or within the first years of starting over in alien lands. It was a trail of tears on a continental scale, an exodus that would forever be remembered as one of the great tragedies of Jewish history. Back in Spain, the public squares stood empty and eerily quiet in the aftermath of the expulsion. The Jewish quarters, or juderias, of Toledo, Seville, and Córdoba became virtual ghost towns. The shops shuttered and the once vibrant streets deserted. A centuries-old thread in the social fabric of Spain had been abruptly severed, leaving behind a gaping void. The expulsion of the Jews was the final exclamation point on Torquemada's legacy, the ultimate triumph of his vision of a purified Spain locked firmly in the grip of Catholic orthodoxy. He had overseen the total subjugation of Spanish society to the whims and dictates of the Inquisition, twisting religion into an instrument of state terror. Yet, even in his final days, as he lay on his deathbed in a monastery in Avila, Torquemada remained convinced of the righteousness of his life's work. Attended by a retinue of black-robed monks, he made a final confession and received the last rites, secure in his belief that he would soon be welcomed into the kingdom of heaven as a faithful servant of God. On September 16th, 1498, Tomás de Torquemada breathed his last, his emaciated body twisted by years of fasting and mortification. His passing was marked by an outpouring of grief from the Catholic monarchs and the church hierarchy, who hailed him as a spiritual warrior who had battled heroically to preserve the integrity of the faith. In truth, Torquemada left behind a decidedly mixed legacy, a Spain purged of religious minorities, but deeply traumatized by the methods used to achieve that end. The Inquisition he had built into a ruthless instrument of social control would continue to operate for centuries, targeting an ever-expanding array of perceived heresies and crimes. Even in death, Torquemada inspired fear and revulsion. His tomb in the monastery at Avila became an object of grim fascination, said to emanate a cold, unsettling aura. According to one legend, a group of conversos broke into the crypt in the dead of night and stole Torquemada's bones, scattering them in a secret location so that his remains would be denied a final resting place. A symbolic act of revenge for the Inquisitor General's crimes against their people. For all his fanatical piety and single-minded devotion to the church, one wonders if Torquemada was ever truly at peace. Did he manage to suppress the flickers of doubt and remorse that must have occasionally surfaced during his campaigns of terror? Or in his final moments, as he tottered on the edge of eternity, was he haunted by the faces of the hundreds sent to the stake on his orders? The mothers and grandfathers and trembling adolescents whose last agonized screams had rent the air. Such questions will forever remain unanswered, buried with Torquemada in the shadows of the past. What is certain is that he left an indelible mark on Spanish history and on the larger story of religious intolerance. He came to embody the terrifying excesses that could be unleashed when the power of the state merged with the dictates of dogma. The true toll of Torquemada's Inquisition is incalculable, extending far beyond the number of lives consumed in the flames of the autos de fe. It encompasses the spreading stain of fear that seeped into every corner of Spanish society for generations, the wounds of trauma and severance inflicted on entire communities. It's reckoned in the crushing of dissent, creativity, and intellectual inquiry, the warping of the Spanish soul towards insularity and paranoia. In a sense, the Inquisition's true violence was more subtle and diffuse than the physical horrors inflicted on heretics in dank torture chambers. It lay in the way it trained a society to police itself, to internalize a state of constant suspicion and self-censorship. It was an early experiment in totalitarian control, a preview of the 20th century police states that would take such techniques to industrial scale. And at the center of this terrible web of surveillance and suppression sat Tomás de Torquemada, the ascetic priest who had transformed his personal obsessions into a form of institutionalized terror. A man for whom the Christian imperative to love one's neighbor had curdled into a passion for inflicting exquisite suffering in the name of an angry, vengeful God. Torquemada's name would echo through the centuries as a byword for fanaticism and cruelty, a symbol of the depths to which those convinced of their own righteousness could sink in, tormenting their fellow human beings. His spectre would be invoked by later generations as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blurring the lines between spiritual and secular power. Yet in the context of his own time, Torquemada was not an aberration or outlier. He was simply the most ruthlessly efficient exponent of a strain of religious absolutism that had deep roots in the European psyche. The fact that his brand of pious sadism was given free rein by the crown and the church hierarchy reflects the degree to which medieval society had become infected by the idea that the path to collective salvation lay in the persecution of difference. In this sense, To simply dismiss Torquemada as a monster or psychopath is to avoid grappling with the more uncomfortable implications of his story. It lets us off the hook from examining the ways in which his mindset and methods were an outgrowth of societal pathologies that are still very much with us. The human capacity for tribalism, for scapegoating the other, for retreating into absolutist certainty in the face of a complex world. Torquemada's life and legacy are a stark reminder that the greatest atrocities are often committed not by inhuman demons, but by painfully ordinary people who have convinced themselves they are acting in the name of a higher good. That the road to the Autos de Fe was paved with the all-too-human bricks of fear, prejudice, and self-righteousness. In the end, perhaps the most chilling aspect of Torquemada's story is not the depths of his personal cruelty, but the ease with which he was able to bend an entire society to his will. To make the burning of human beings in public squares seem like an act of piety and communal purification. It's a reminder of the fragility of the values we like to think of as self-evident: human rights, religious freedom, the rule of law. Of the way the veneer of civilization can be stripped away with startling speed when fear and dogma are allowed to run rampant. And so, Tomás de Torquemada, Inquisitor General of Spain, takes his place in the annals of history as a figure of enduring fascination and horror. A man who embodied the darkest impulses of the medieval mind, even as he anticipated the machinery of oppression that would blight the modern world. In the final accounting, he was neither a saint nor a demon, but something perhaps more troubling: a true believer whose unwavering conviction in his own rectitude unleashed a reign of terror that forever changed the face of. As the Inquisition's power faded in the 16th century, its officials desperately clung to their diminishing authority. But the world was changing around them as new ideas challenged the Church's dominance. The Protestant Reformation, kicked off by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, fractured Catholic control over Europe. Reformers denounced church corruption and championed individual faith over blind obedience to pope and priest. Across the continent, people eagerly embraced these refreshing notions of religious freedom. For Inquisitors, it was a distressing development. Protestantism, with its emphasis on the believer's personal relationship with God, left little room for their inquisitorial function. If scripture, not papal decree, was the final authority, then sniffing out heresy became a far more problematic proposition. Suddenly, the clear lines between orthodox and heterodox began to blur. The Reformation wasn't an overnight revolution, but a gradual weakening of the Vatican's once absolute power. In Northern Europe especially, Inquisitors found themselves adrift in an increasingly pluralistic religious landscape. Their accustomed tactics of intimidation and persecution proved less effective when their targets could simply flee to Lutheran or Calvinist territories. Even within the Catholic world, support for heavy-handed heretic hunting was no longer universal. Influential scholars and clergymen like Erasmus began to question the methods of the Inquisition, promoting a vision of Christianity rooted more in love and tolerance than rigid dogma. The Inquisition, it seemed, was falling out of step with the times. Nonetheless, Inquisitors soldiered on through the 1500s, often lashing out with greater brutality as their power waned. The Spanish Inquisition, under Torquemada and his successors, rained terror upon the conversos and Moriscos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Catholicism under duress. Across Italy, witches and freethinkers became favoured targets. But this was more the thrashing of a wounded beast than a renaissance. By 1600, the Inquisition's glory days were clearly behind it. No longer could a single priest with a papal seal strike dread across the land. The 30 Years' War cemented the partition of Europe into Catholic and Protestant states, while the seeds of the Enlightenment were starting to sprout. As scientists, philosophers, and freethinkers began to openly question religious superstition in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Inquisition came to be seen as a barbaric relic of a more ignorant age. Infamous cases like that of Galileo, persecuted by the Inquisition for the heresy of heliocentrism, only further blackened its reputation. The tribunals and dungeons remained, but their reach was shortening. The Inquisition staggered on for another 200 years in various forms, still occasionally burning a heretic or banning a book. But its fangs had been pulled. By the time Napoleon conquered Spain in 1808 and abolished the Inquisition there, it was already effectively extinguished as a force in European life. An institution born from the mania of the Crusades and the paranoia of the Cathars had no place in the modern world that was emerging. Its formal abolition by Pope Pius VII in 1814 was little more than a funeral for a long-dead creature. The Inquisition story, spanning 6 centuries, had reached its inexorable end. Not with a bang, but a bureaucratic whimper. From Dominic to Torquemada, Bernard Gui to Robert Le Bougre, generations of men had wielded its terrifying power, and now those days were done. The Inquisitor, that feared figure in black robes, would stalk the shadows no more, but his legacy, one of cruelty and courage, torture and tragedy, would linger on in history's pages and humanity's nightmares. Never again, perhaps, would the world see his like, and most would say, thank God for that. For as the Inquisition passed into history, Europe stepped forward into a new era, one that would bring its own horrors and holocausts, but in which the notion of a man being burned alive for his private beliefs grew blessedly alien. The Inquisitor's work was finished, but his grim lessons were only beginning to be understood. As the Inquisition's power grew, so too did the notoriety and mythos surrounding its most zealous agents. Whispers spread of men cloaked in dark robes, arriving unannounced in towns and villages, ready to root out heresy by any means necessary. One name in particular began to strike fear into the hearts of the devout and dissenter alike: Tomás de Torquemada. Born in 1420 into a family of conversos, Jews who had converted to Catholicism, Torquemada seemed destined for a life in the church from an early age. He took his vows as a Dominican friar at the tender age of 14 and quickly developed a reputation for his fierce intellect and even fiercer piety. As a young man, Torquemada earned the favour of the Spanish monarchs King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I, who shared his fervent desire to purge Spain of religious impurity. When the Inquisition was established in Spain in 1478, Torquemada was the obvious choice to serve as its first Inquisitor General. Under Torquemada's leadership, the Spanish Inquisition reached new heights of efficiency and brutality. He streamlined the process of identifying, interrogating, and punishing suspected heretics. Tribunals were established in every major city, with a network of spies and informants ferreting out anyone who might dare question the Church's teachings. Torquemada took special interest in targeting Spain's converso population. Despite their outward professions of loyalty to the Catholic faith, many conversos were suspected of continuing to practice Judaism in secret. For Torquemada, this represented the ultimate betrayal, a rot within the heart of Spanish society that had to be thoroughly excised. No one was safe from the Inquisitor General's crusade, not even those at the very top of Spanish society. Over his nearly 2-decade reign, Torquemada prosecuted nobles, priests, and even members of the royal court. The very fear of being denounced was often enough to send the wealthy and powerful fleeing the country. But it was ordinary people who bore the brunt of Torquemada's inquisitorial zeal. Across Spain, accusations of heresy multiplied, as neighbour turned against neighbour and families were torn apart by suspicion. The Inquisition's dungeons overflowed with the accused, many of whom would never again see the light of day. Those hauled before Torquemada's tribunals faced a grim fate. The fortunate ones were forced to perform humiliating acts of public penance, such as wearing a San Benito, a penitential garment that marked one as a convicted heretic. Many more were sentenced to torture, their agony prolonged by the Inquisition's medical experts to avoid death that would prevent the extraction of a confession. The ultimate punishment was to be burned at the stake. The auto da fe, or act of faith, became a dreaded public spectacle throughout Spain. Condemned heretics, gagged to prevent them from crying out, would be led to the stake before jeering crowds, the crackling of the flames mingling with the tolling of church bells. It's estimated that during Torquemada's tenure as Inquisitor General, some 2,000 Spaniards were burned at the stake. Tens of thousands more suffered torture, imprisonment, and social ruin, all in the name of preserving the purity of the Catholic faith. Yet even as he unleashed terror across Spain, Torquemada himself remained an enigmatic figure. He lived a Spartan, almost ascetic life, eschewing the trappings of his power and position. While some painted him as a sadist who delighted in human suffering, others saw him as a true believer, a man who had devoted his life to what he earnestly believed was the work of God. Perhaps the truth, as is so often the case, lies somewhere in between. To paint Torquemada as a mustache-twirling villain or a misunderstood saint is to ignore the very human complexities that make his story so chilling. He was a man of his time and place, in a society where religious conformity was prized above all else, a society that allowed a single individual to wield such terrible power over the lives of so many. But if Torquemada's methods were the product of his time, his legacy would long outlive him. The Spanish Inquisition would continue on and off for over 3 centuries after his death, perpetuating the machinery of persecution he had so ruthlessly perfected. And his name would become synonymous with the very concept of the Inquisition, a byword for intolerance, cruelty, and the dangers of unquestioned authority. It's perhaps fitting, then, that Torquemada's final resting place remains a mystery. His tomb was ransacked and his remains scattered during an anti-clerical revolt in the early 19th century, a fate that seems almost karmic for a man who visited so much suffering on so many. But while his bones may have been lost to history, the spectre of Torquemada looms large in the dark annals of the Inquisition, a reminder of the human capacity for both devout faith and pitiless cruelty. As the Spanish Inquisition reached its apex under Torquemada, the psychological toll of the Inquisition on both its victims and perpetrators was becoming increasingly apparent. For those caught up in the machinery of persecution, the ordeal often began long before they ever set foot in an interrogation chamber. The very act of being accused could be enough to upend one's life. Inquisitors often relied on a system of secret denunciations, meaning that anyone, a disgruntled neighbor, a business rival, even a family member, could level charges of heresy against you. The accused would then be plucked from their lives, their homes and possessions seized, their fate suddenly thrown into terrifying uncertainty. Many languished for months or even years in the Inquisition's dank, overcrowded prisons, never knowing when they might be called before the tribunal. The isolation and squalor took a heavy mental toll, as prisoners grappled with the twin spectres of impending torture and eternal damnation. Those who were finally brought before the Inquisitors found themselves subjected to grueling interrogations designed to break their will and extract a confession at any cost. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and psychological manipulation were all common tactics, as were threats against family members or promises of leniency if one simply admitted their guilt. And then, of course, there was the torture. The Inquisition's methods were honed to maximize pain and minimize the risk of death, which would rob the accused of the chance to confess and save their immortal soul. From the rack to the strappado, from waterboarding to toe-crushing devices, the creativity and cruelty employed in the torture chamber was boundless. Even those who managed to survive the Inquisition with their lives often emerged deeply scarred, both physically and psychologically. Many grappled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, plagued by nightmares, flashbacks, and a pervasive sense of dread. Some turned to self-harm or substance abuse to numb the pain. Others simply withdrew from the world, unable to trust anyone after their horrific ordeals. But it was not only the accused who suffered under this system. The psychological burden weighed heavily on the Inquisitors themselves, many of whom struggled to reconcile their actions with their faith. Take the story of one unnamed Inquisitor, who late in life penned a letter to a friend, expressing deep remorse over the role he had played. "In the service of what I believe to be a just and holy cause, I have done great violence to my fellow man," he wrote. "I have torn flesh, broken bones, and shattered minds, all in the name of God. But in so doing, I fear I have only fractured my own soul." This Inquisitor was far from alone in his doubts. For many, the psychological toll of the work was a heavy cross to bear. To believe that one was doing the Lord's work while inflicting such grievous harm on others. It was a paradox that haunted even the most devout. Some, like Torquemada, seemed to resolve this cognitive dissonance by doubling down on their zealotry, convincing themselves that the ends justified even the most brutal means. But for others, the weight of what they had done and witnessed slowly ate away at them, an existential rot that no amount of prayer or penance could fully heal. It's a testament to the incredible power of belief, both as a salve and as a weapon. For the Inquisitors, their faith was both what drove them to commit such acts and what allowed them to live with themselves in the aftermath. But it was also that same faith that made them question, that nagged at them in the dark hours of the night, that forced them to grapple with the true nature of the righteous path. In the end, the Inquisition would exact a toll on the hearts and minds of medieval Europe that can scarcely be calculated. It was a machine that fed on fear, that warped the very social fabric of communities and turned the faithful against one another. And for those caught up in its gears, whether as victim or perpetrator, accused or accuser, the scars it left behind would linger long after the last pyre had burned out. As the 16th century dawned, the landscape of Europe was shifting in ways that would ultimately spell the end of the Inquisition's iron grip on the continent. But it would not go gentle into that good night. The forces of intolerance and persecution had tasted power, and they would not relinquish it easily. The Protestant Reformation, kicked off by Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses in 1517, represented the most direct challenge yet to the Catholic Church's spiritual monopoly. As reformist ideas spread like wildfire across Europe, the Inquisition found itself increasingly on the back foot, struggling to stem the tide of what it saw as a new and insidious form of heresy. In some ways, the Reformation only served to intensify the Inquisition's brutality, as it lashed out in a desperate attempt to reassert control. Protestants became a new target of inquisitorial zeal, with many facing the same tortures and fiery fate as the heretics of old. But the sheer scale of the movement proved too much to contain. For every heretic burned, 10 more seemed to spring up in their place. At the same time, the Enlightenment was beginning to dawn over Europe, bringing with it new ideas about individual liberty, religious tolerance, and the importance of reason over blind faith. Slowly but surely, the intellectual and moral justifications for the Inquisition's brutality were eroding. Faced with this two-pronged assault, the Inquisition gradually began to lose its grip. Its power waned first in Protestant-controlled areas of northern Europe, then more slowly in Catholic strongholds like Spain and Italy. By the late 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment was in full swing, and the notion of torturing and killing people for their religious beliefs was becoming increasingly seen as a barbaric relic of a darker time. The Inquisition would linger on in various forms into the early 19th century, a testament to the stubborn persistence of old institutions and older prejudices. But by the time the Spanish Inquisition was formally abolished in 1834, it had long since ceased to be the force of terror it had once been. Its decline and fall was a gradual process, less a single moment of triumph than a slow fading into the mists of history. And yet, its impact would be felt long after the last tribunal had shut its doors. The Inquisition left a scar on the European psyche, a reminder of the cruelty and intolerance that could be unleashed in the name of faith. It also left a more tangible legacy in the form of its meticulous records. The vast archives of the Inquisition, chronicling every accusation, every interrogation, every grim sentence handed down, would become a treasure trove for later historians seeking to understand this dark chapter in human history. And what a chapter it was. Over the course of its 6th century reign, the Inquisition touched the lives of countless individuals across Europe and beyond. Some estimates place the number of people tried by the Inquisition at around 150,000, with anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 executed, though the true toll, both in terms of lives lost and psyches shattered, is likely far higher. Beyond the sheer numbers, the Inquisition represented something deeper and more insidious: the human impulse to enforce conformity and punish difference. It was a reminder of how easily faith could be weaponized, how the line between piety and cruelty could blur in the hands of the zealous and the powerful. And at the heart of it all were the Inquisitors themselves, the men charged with carrying out this grim work in the name of God and Church. To see them as purely evil or purely righteous is to deny their humanity, to ignore the complex web of faith, fear, and fanaticism that drove their actions. For some, like Torquemada, the work of the Inquisition seems to have been a calling, a sacred duty that superseded all other concerns. For others, it was a burden, a millstone around the neck that dragged them down into doubt and despair. And for still others, it was likely something in between, a job to be done, a role to be played, without too much thought given to the moral implications. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the Inquisition, that the capacity for both good and evil lies within us all, waiting to be unleashed by the right combination of circumstance, belief, and power. It is a sobering thought, and one that should give us pause as we consider our own beliefs and the lengths we might go to defend them. As we close the book on this dark chapter of human history, it's worth reflecting on what lessons we can take from the Inquisition's rise and fall. At its core, the Inquisition was a failure of empathy, a failure to see the humanity in those who believed or thought differently. It was a triumph of dogma over reason, of conformity over diversity, of fear over compassion. These are not failings unique to the men of the Inquisition, nor to the medieval world in which they lived. They are timeless human struggles, battles that are fought anew in every generation. And while the specific beliefs and institutions may change, the underlying dynamics remain hauntingly familiar. We see echoes of the Inquisition's intolerance in the persecution of minority groups, in the suppression of dissenting voices, in the use of torture and terror to enforce ideological conformity. We see its legacy in the surveillance states of the modern world, in the databases and dossiers that track our every move and thought. But perhaps most of all, we see the Inquisition's shadow in the way that belief, whether religious, political, or ideological, can so easily be twisted into a justification for cruelty. It is a reminder that no idea, no matter how noble or sacred, is immune to this danger, that even the most righteous among us can be led down dark paths by the strength of their convictions. Facing this uncomfortable truth, requires a kind of moral courage that is all too rare. It means being willing to question our own beliefs, to hold them up to the light of reason and empathy. It means recognizing that those we consider heretics or infidels are still, at the end of the day, human beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. Most of all, it means learning to see shades of grey in a world that often seems to demand black and white, to understand that even the most reviled figures of history were complex human beings, not embodiments of pure evil, that even the most righteous among us are capable of terrible things, given the right circumstances. This is not to excuse the actions of the Inquisitors, nor to minimize the suffering they inflicted, but it is to recognize their humanity, to try to understand the forces that shaped them and the beliefs that drove them. Only by grappling with these complexities can we hope to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. In the end, the story of the Inquisition is not just a history lesson, but a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of the darkness that lurks within the human heart and the terrible things that can be done in the name of righteousness. But it is also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the ability of people to endure and overcome even the most unimaginable horrors. As we navigate the challenges of our own time, the clashes of culture, the struggles of faith, the battles over truth and power, we would do well to keep the lessons of the Inquisition close at hand, to remember that the path to hell is often paved with good intentions, and that the only way to truly defeat intolerance is with understanding, with empathy, and with an unyielding commitment to the dignity of every human being. In the final analysis, the legacy of the Inquisition is a complex one, a tangle of faith and fear, cruelty and conviction, darkness and light. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is this: that the struggle for a more just and tolerant world is not a battle that can be won in a single lifetime, but an ongoing journey that demands constant vigilance and unwavering compassion. It is a journey that we are all called to take, in ways big and small. And while the road may be long and the obstacles many, the destination, a world where the fires of the Inquisition are well and truly extinguished, is one well worth striving for. As Torquemada's reign of terror reached new heights, the psychological toll on both the persecuted and the persecutors grew ever more severe. For those living in constant fear of accusations and arrests, the stress was unimaginable. At any moment, a neighbour's denouncement or an inquisitor's suspicion could shatter their lives. They watched in horror as friends and loved ones were dragged away to dank dungeons, never to be seen again. Many cracked under the pressure, driven to depression, madness, or even suicide. Those who did come under inquisitorial scrutiny faced the dread of interrogation, knowing the agony that awaited in those torture chambers if they did not confess to whatever heresy was demanded of them. Innocence was no protection once the inquisitors set their sights on you. Yet we often overlook the anguish borne by the inquisitors themselves. True, men like Torquemada cloaked themselves in righteous zeal, seemingly relishing their role as God's enforcers. They could justify the screams of their victims as the necessary price of purging evil from the world. But beneath that pious facade, many inquisitors were tormented souls, racked by doubt and guilt over the suffering they inflicted. How could they be certain the confessions extracted under duress were true? What if they were wrong, condemning the innocent to the stake? As much as they tried to tell themselves it was the Lord's work, their actions flew in the face of Christ's message of mercy and forgiveness. Sleep would not have come easy to an inquisitor with a heavy conscience. The faces of the accused would haunt their dreams. The old woman raving deliriously after days on the rack, the defiant youth who refused to submit to their authority, the wailing children torn from their parents as Judaizers. Waking brought no peace either. Each dawn only meant a new day of grim duties that chipped away at their humanity. Some broke under the strain, taking their own lives or fleeing in the night to escape their sins. Others numbed themselves with drink or vice, trying to briefly forget the horrors they authored. A poignant example of this comes from an account of an aged inquisitor, his mind crumbling in the final days of his life. As he lay on his deathbed, a young priest attending him noted how the old man trembled and moaned, lost in feverish hallucination. He muttered the names of long-ago victims, begging their forgiveness for what he had done to them in the torture chambers decades before. In fleeting moments of lucidity, he frantically grabbed at the priest's robes, desperately pleading for absolution. How could God ever forgive the devils he had unleashed? The priest, though disturbed, tried to reassure the dying inquisitor that his service to the Lord would secure his salvation. Whether this was truly any comfort to the old man in his last extremity is questionable. More than the fear for his eternal soul, he seemed gripped by deep remorse for the pain and ruin he had wrought in his long career. With the shadow of death looming, the doctrinal justifications rang hollow. He was just a frail, fallible man, not the righteous champion he had once imagined himself to be. That crushing realization, coupled with far too many sins to count, made for a grim reckoning indeed. In the ultimate twist of fate, an inquisitor who had presided over countless anguished ends now faced his own mortality in perhaps greater torment than his victims. One cannot help but feel a sliver of pity for the inquisitor in that bleak moment, broken by his own cruelty in the unblinking gaze of eternity. How many other inquisitors met their ends in such distress, the scales finally fallen from their eyes to the horror they had served? We can only speculate. What is clear, though, is that, whether in pangs of conscience or depths of callousness, the role of inquisitor took a severe psychological toll. To be the hand that tortures and the voice that condemns day after day is a path to madness or monstrosity. The human mind is not meant to bear such darkness unscathed. But men like Torquemada show us the more chilling possibilities. For some inquisitors, brutality seemed to be no burden at all. If anything, they reveled in it, drunk on the power over life and death, possessed by sadistic appetites for suffering. Torquemada's iron-fisted rule saw the Inquisition reach new heights of ruthless efficiency and terror. Fueled by his paranoid obsession with the conversos, he unleashed a tidal wave of arrests, determined to root out any hint of lingering Jewish or Muslim faith. Informants and spies infested every city, eager to denounce their neighbors for any suspicious behavior. The accused were hauled from their homes in the dead of night and dragged in chains to the Inquisition's secret prisons. There, Torquemada's meticulous methods awaited them. No detail was too small to seize upon. No discrepancy too minor to justify hours of bone-shattering torture. The Inquisitor General had a perverse fascination with pain, devising ever more fiendish devices to twist body and break spirit. He took a personal interest in high-profile prisoners, often supervising interrogations directly to savor each scream and sob he could wring from his victim. Even the hardened professional torturers blanched at the smile that played over his gaunt face in those chambers of agony. For those not granted the mercy of death during torture, a public spectacle awaited. Torquemada turned the auto da fe, the ritual penance and execution of heretics, into ornate pageantry. Massive crowds gathered to jeer as the condemned were paraded through city streets in black robes painted with hellfire, monstrous paper hats announcing their crimes. Zealous friars whipped the mob to a frenzy, exhorting them to curse the enemies of God. As the flames devoured flesh and stoked the terrified wails of the dying, Torquemada looked on with rapture, confident he was cleansing Spain, one pyre at a time. Yet incredibly, Torquemada saw himself as a righteous man, a humble servant doing the hard but necessary work of God. He fasted to the brink of death, scourged himself until his back was ribboned with scars, all in penitence for the sins of those he persecuted. In his fevered mind, he was a holy warrior locked in cosmic battle with Satan, his every brutality justified by the glory of his crusade. The blood on his hands was washed clean by his piety. He would burn 1,000 to save one soul from damnation. So perhaps men like Torquemada are the most terrifying of all. Not the reluctant inquisitor sickened by his own cruelty. Not the sadist pursuing torture for perverse pleasure. But the true believer, the unflinching zealot convinced of his own righteousness, even as he murders innocents and revels in their suffering. Torquemada was monstrous, not in spite of his faith, but because of it. His religious fervor burned so hot, it left no room for doubt or mercy or humanity. It forged a creature of singular purpose and devotion to match any demon of the pit. The example of Torquemada cast the psychological toll of the Inquisition in a different light. For men like him, the only toll was on the thousands of lives he destroyed. His own conscience was unscarred, even as his deeds scarred all of Spain with trauma that echoed through generations. So, as we ponder the anguish of the Inquisitors, we must grapple with the unsettling reality that some were untroubled by their own monstrosity, perhaps even ennobled by it. Dogma can be a dangerous armor against remorse. Yet as the 16th century dawned, the armor was starting to crack. The Inquisition, though still a dreaded force, would find its power slowly slipping away in the decades to come. The Europe that had given rise to Torquemada would soon look very different indeed. And so Torquemada's reign of terror continued, fueled by his own zealotry and the support of the royal couple who saw the Inquisition as a useful tool for consolidating their power. The stories of those who fell victim to his campaigns are as numerous as they are heartbreaking. There was the case of Benito Garcia, a converso in the town of Astorga, who was accused of Judaizing, secretly practicing Jewish rituals. Despite a lack of evidence and Garcia's adamant denials, he was subjected to brutal torture, including having his arms and legs bound so tightly that blood vessels burst. He eventually confessed, likely just to make the pain stop, and was burned at the stake in 1491. Garcia's story was all too common during this dark chapter. Dozens of other conversos met similar fates in towns across Spain, publicly humiliated in elaborate ceremonies before being consigned to the flames as onlookers jeered. The constant threat of denunciation by neighbors or even family members created a pervasive atmosphere of dread and mistrust. Even those who tried to flee found no escape from Torquemada's reach. In 1492, shortly after the fall of Granada, the monarchs issued the Alhambra decree, expelling all practicing Jews from Spain. Facing this ultimatum, many chose to convert rather than leave their homes behind. But for Torquemada, these conversions were not to be trusted. He ordered his inquisitors to be extra vigilant for any signs of backsliding among the new Christians. This climate of suspicion took a devastating psychological toll, not just on the accused, but on the accusers and judges as well. Emmanuel Aboab, a Jewish chronicler of the expulsion, wrote of formerly friendly neighbors now eyeing each other warily, wondering if anyone they knew might secretly be an informant. Families were ripped apart as parents testified against children, husbands against wives, each desperate to save themselves from the Inquisitors' wrath. Even some of the Inquisitors themselves buckled under the strain of their grim duties. One young Dominican, Pedro Arbues, was so troubled by the screams of the tortured that he had to be constantly reminded of the nobility of his work by his superiors. Others whispered of Torquemada's own mental state, claiming the Grand Inquisitor was increasingly paranoid and obsessive, seeing enemies everywhere. Perhaps it's no wonder then that the Inquisition in this period reached a fever pitch of cruelty and fanaticism. The years of 1481 to 1492 alone saw an estimated 2,000 executions. Seville in particular, Torquemada's power base, gained a reputation as a city of ghosts, where the stench of charred flesh hung heavy in the squares. The sheer efficiency of Torquemada's Inquisition was as impressive as it was terrifying. His network of spies and informants extended into every town and village, ferreting out any hint of heresy. Detailed records were kept of every arrest, interrogation, and sentence. In many ways, it was an early precursor to the kind of totalitarian police state that would re-emerge centuries later. But despite its fearsome effectiveness, the Inquisition under Torquemada sowed the seeds of its own decline. The climate of terror it created was ultimately unsustainable. The conversos, many of whom were among Spain's most economically productive citizens, gradually began to leave for more tolerant lands. And as the Inquisition's tactics grew more shocking, so too did the voices raised in protest against it, even from within the church itself. Cracks were beginning to show in the centuries-old armor of Christendom. In 1492, the same year as the Jewish expulsion from Spain, a little-known Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus made landfall in a new world. This discovery would soon shift the balance of power in Europe and loosen the church's monopoly on knowledge and power. The Reformation, when it came a few decades later, would further splinter Catholic hegemony. Torquemada, of course, would not live to see this slow-motion rebuke of his life's work. He died in 1498, still secure in his conviction that he had been doing God's will. It's said that he expressed a wish to his deathbed confessor that he could have done even more to root out heresy, a chilling reminder of the depths of his zealotry. And yet, as the Grand Inquisitor breathed his last, one wonders if some small part of him felt doubt or regret. Did he think back on the faces of the condemned, the pleas of the innocent, the children left orphaned and destitute? Or were such human concerns beneath the great Catholic warrior assured of his heavenly reward? We can only speculate. What we do know is that Torquemada left a legacy that would long outlive him, one written in blood and ash and terror. His name became a byword for fanaticism, uttered as a warning by those who feared where unchecked religious fervor might lead. The great American thinker Henry David Thoreau, writing 3 centuries after Torquemada's death, could have been referring directly to the Grand Inquisitor when he warned, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." For in his single-minded quest to prune away heresy, Torquemada had poisoned the very soil in which true faith and morality might grow. It would be all too easy to dismiss him as a monster, an aberration. But to do so is to ignore the uncomfortable reality that he was a man of his time, a product of a society that had long equated piety with persecution. The Inquisition did not arise in a vacuum, but was an outgrowth of centuries of religiously sanctioned violence and intolerance. Nor were Torquemada's methods entirely without precedent. Many of the brutal interrogation techniques he championed, from waterboarding to stretching victims on the rack, would be revived by later generations of state torturers. The Inquisition was, in many ways, a chilling precursor to the type of ideologically motivated state terrorism that would convulse the 20th century. But if Torquemada's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism, it is also a more complex meditation on the nature of evil and complicity. For every cruel inquisitor, there were countless more who played smaller but no less vital roles in the machinery of persecution. The accusers, the jailers, the scribes who dutifully recorded each confession and sentence. And beyond them, the wider society that tolerated and even celebrated the Inquisition's grim work. It is comforting to imagine that, had we lived in such times, we would have been among the righteous few who spoke out against injustice. But history suggests that most people, when faced with a choice between their conscience and their community, will opt for conformity. The sad truth is that the Inquisition endured for as long as it did, because on some level, enough people wanted it to. This is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Inquisition, that evil thrives not just through the actions of individual villains, but through the acquiescence of the rest of us. It is a reminder that the price of a more just world is constant vigilance and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. We must be on guard not just against the Torquemadas in our midst, but against the Torquemada in ourselves. As we reflect on this dark chapter in human history, it is worth asking what future generations might someday condemn in our own society. What institutions or beliefs that we take for granted will one day be seen as medieval relics, unjust to their core? It is a question that should give us all pause. For now, we can only strive to learn from the sins of the past, to build a world where piety is rooted not in persecution, but in compassion, where righteousness is measured not by the ferocity of one's faith, but by the kindness of one's actions. This is the unfinished work that Torquemada and his ilk leave us, the long struggle to bend the arc of history toward justice, to make the kingdom of God not a reign of terror, but a reign of love. It's a fitting irony that Torquemada's name, translated from Spanish, means tower tormented. For in the end, perhaps no one was more tormented than the Grand Inquisitor himself, forever haunted by the screams of the damned, forever chasing a purity that receded before him like a desert mirage. May his story stand as a testament to the folly of certainty, and a reminder that even the most righteous among us have the capacity for cruelty. May we honor the memory of the Inquisition's victims by building a world where no one need fear the knock of the Inquisitor at the door. And may we have the wisdom to know that the work of building such a world is never truly finished, but is the task of every generation, one quiet act of mercy at a time. The life of an Inquisitor was a complex tapestry of piety, brutality, self-doubt, and conviction. These men, often drawn from the most devoted ranks of the Dominican and Franciscan monastic orders, found themselves on the front lines of a spiritual war against heresy. It was a war that demanded both scholarly acumen and a willingness to inflict suffering in the name of defending the faith. To become an Inquisitor was no simple matter. It required extensive training in theology and canon law, the tools needed to identify and prosecute the subtle deviations of heresy. Only the sharpest minds and most unwavering devotion would suffice for such weighty responsibility. Many Inquisitors began their own journeys to this vocation as young men, plucked from their monasteries and sent to study at the great universities of Paris, Bologna, or Salamanca. There they would spend years steeping themselves in doctrine, engaging in spirited debates to hone their rhetorical skills, and learning the fine points of inquisitorial procedure. But book learning alone could not prepare them for the trials that lay ahead. The life of an Inquisitor was often one of constant travel and meagre accommodations, moving from town to town to ferret out heresy wherever it might lurk. Many spent months on the road, staying in damp, Spartan lodgings, their days a blur of interrogations, witness interviews, and poring over confessions. It was a lonely, ascetic existence, far removed from the cloistered contemplation of the monastery. When an Inquisitor arrived in a new town, he often faced an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility. Local authorities might resent the intrusion into their affairs, while the populace feared the scrutiny of their religious lives. Inquisitors learned to tread carefully, leveraging their authority judiciously, cultivating networks of informants, and using the pageantry of their office to inspire awe and compliance. But once an investigation was underway, any pretense of diplomacy quickly evaporated. The inquisitorial process was an intricate dance of intimidation, manipulation, and outright brutality, all aimed at extracting confessions and rooting out heresy. Inquisitors were masters of psychological pressure, skilled at exploiting the doubts and fears of their subjects. They might begin with seemingly innocuous questions, lulling the accused into complacency before suddenly confronting them with damning witness testimony or seized evidence. If a suspect proved resistant to these tactics, the Inquisitor had other, crueler tools at his disposal. The church-sanctioned use of torture was perhaps the most notorious aspect of inquisitorial methodology, a practice as ingenious as it was brutal. Thumbscrews, the rack, the strappado, these devices were designed to inflict maximum suffering while leaving minimal marks, a dark art perfected over centuries. The screams of the tortured were a constant soundtrack to an inquisitor's work, echoing through dank dungeon chambers. But the grim faces of the inquisitors rarely betrayed any hint of pity or remorse. After all, they acted with the full moral authority of the church behind them. The greatest sin, they believed, would be to allow a heretic to go free and spread their spiritual poison. Still, one cannot help but wonder about the psychological toll such grisly work must have taken on these men. Even the most zealous inquisitor surely grappled with moments of doubt and despair, lying awake at night, haunted by the faces of those he had condemned to the stake. Many turned to prayer and penance to assuage their troubled consciences, convincing themselves their actions were righteous. Others simply learned to harden their hearts, becoming increasingly brutal and fanatical to suppress any glimmer of sympathy. Perhaps no figure embodies this ruthless single-mindedness more than Tomás de Torquemada, the infamous Grand Inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition. A man of fierce piety and political cunning, Torquemada rose to become the most feared and powerful inquisitor in history. But his story and the bloody legacy he left behind must wait for another evening. For now, let us reflect on the strange and tragic existence of the medieval inquisitor, a life of both spiritual devotion and shocking violence, where one could believe themselves the righteous hand of God while inflicting unimaginable cruelty on their fellow man. In their zeal to defend the faith, they created a culture of paranoia and intolerance whose shadow would long outlast them. But they too were in some sense prisoners, trapped by the fervent convictions of their age. As we drift off to sleep, let us ponder what dreams may have haunted the sleep of an inquisitor. Were they dreams of hellfire and damnation, or of a desperate desire for absolution? Perhaps, in the depths of night, even the most hardened of them secretly yearned for a world without the screams of the innocent. But such doubts were a luxury they could ill afford in the cold light of day, with the fate of immortal souls hanging in the balance. So they pressed on, steeling themselves for the next interrogation, the next pyre, the next lost soul in need of salvation, no matter the cost. It was a brutal and thankless existence, but one they convinced themselves was ordained by the Almighty. Such is the strange calculus of the fanatic mind, where any sin can be justified in service of a higher cause. The tragedy of the Inquisitor was not that they were monsters, but that they were all too human, pious men warped by the furious certainty of their convictions. In their relentless drive to purge the world of heresy, they succumbed to a more insidious corruption, that of the soul. And so they remain with us, stoic spectres on the fringes of our historical memory, at once objects of revulsion and uneasy fascination, cautionary tales of the perils of righteous zeal untethered from compassion. Perhaps as we surrender to our dreams, we may spare a moment of pity for these haunted men and a shudder of gratitude that their age has passed into history. In our world of religious and ideological strife, the temptations of the inquisitorial mindset remain as potent as ever. But with wisdom and empathy, we may yet avert our steps from the path of the Inquisitor and find our way to a kinder, more tolerant future. And on that note, let us bid good night to the restless spirits of the Inquisitors and to the bloody pageant of the medieval world they embodied. May your dreams be gentler than theirs, and your hearts leavened with mercy. Sleep well, dear listener, and let history be your guide and comfort in the watches of the night. As the Spanish Inquisition reached its brutal apex under Thomas de Torquemada, it must have seemed to engulf all of Spain in a suffocating pall of fear and suspicion, especially for the conversos, those Jews and Muslims who had already faced the agonizing choice of abandoning their faith or facing persecution. It was a time when even an errant word or suspicious glance from a neighbor could mean facing the Inquisitors' wrath. One can only imagine the dread that must have gripped a converso family when that fateful knock came at the door. To open it and see the grim faces of the Inquisitor and his armed guards, to hear that you or a loved one had been denounced and must now submit to questioning. In that moment, the fears that had always lurked at the edges of one's mind, of discovery, of arrest, of torture, suddenly became all too real. Many conversos had already faced the pain of having to publicly renounce their ancestry, of watching their parents or siblings imprisoned or executed for clinging to their traditions. Now, even as baptized Catholics, they found themselves again in the crosshairs, their purity of faith and blood forever suspect. The slightest misstep, a whispered Hebrew prayer, pork left uneaten on a plate, could mean death. For the Inquisitors carrying out Torquemada's reign of terror, their work must have at times seemed unrelenting and unforgiving. To spend one's days listening to tearful denunciations, poring over evidence for signs of heresy, wringing confessions out of terrified prisoners, it is little wonder that many Inquisitors lost their taste for the work over time. Even the most zealous man of faith might begin to question the righteousness of his actions when he found himself ordering the torture of yet another sobbing young woman or trembling old man. Some, like Torquemada, seemed to harden their hearts, becoming ever more ruthless and unsympathetic in their single-minded pursuit of God's work. But others, perhaps, allowed doubts to creep in, even as they continued to go through the motions of their grim duties. Did they lay awake at night, faces of the condemned floating before them, wondering if they were truly serving justice? When they knelt in prayer, did they plead not only for God's blessing but for His forgiveness? It is, of course, impossible to know the inner thoughts of men long dead, but we can examine the journals and letters left behind by some Inquisitors for clues. In one such journal, an aged Inquisitor near the end of his life wrote of his growing misgivings, his fear that he had been more concerned with the purity of the Church than the love of Christ. He described nightmares in which he found himself before God's throne, begging for mercy, but receiving only silence. Another Inquisitor's letters to a colleague reveal a man racked with guilt and doubt, even as he continued to carry out his duties with ruthless efficiency. "I tell myself that I am but an instrument of God's will," he wrote, "but in the dark of night, I wonder if it is not the devil who guides my hand." For the men who served as Inquisitors, perhaps believing in the righteousness of their cause was a form of self-preservation, a way to armor one's soul against the weight of so much suffering and death. To admit doubt was to risk collapse, to be crushed under the burden of what they had done. And so most, it seems, soldiered grimly on, determined to see their holy work through to the end, no matter the cost to others or to themselves. As the 16th century dawned, the Inquisition still cast its long shadow across Spain and beyond. But the world was changing, with new ideas about individual liberty and religious tolerance taking root. Slowly, the Inquisition began to lose its iron grip, its methods coming to be seen as increasingly brutal and antiquated. Protests and uprisings against inquisitorial abuses grew more frequent and more vociferous. Rulers found it politically expedient to limit the Inquisition's power and rein in its worst excesses. The advent of the printing press allowed critiques of the Inquisition to spread like never before, And as the Protestant Reformation took hold, the Catholic Church found itself with bigger threats to contend with than rooting out heresy within its own ranks. By the time the Spanish Inquisition was formally abolished in 1834, it had long since faded as a force to be reckoned with. Its notoriety, however, has only grown in the centuries since. The word Inquisition has become synonymous with intolerance, persecution, and abuse of power. It serves as a chilling reminder of the depths to which otherwise ordinary men can sink when fanaticism is allowed to override empathy and reason. And yet, as monstrous as the Inquisition's crimes were, it is perhaps too easy to dismiss those who carried them out as mere sadists or villains. To do so is to ignore the crucial questions that the Inquisition poses about human nature itself. What is it that allows a person to justify such cruelty in the name of a higher cause? How do otherwise normal people become capable of such extraordinary evil? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are ones that we must continue to grapple with if we are to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. For the danger of righteous zealotry, of moral certainty overriding human decency, is one that has reared its head again and again throughout history, from the show trials of Stalin's Soviet Union to the torture chambers of Pinochet's Chile. It is a peril that lurks within all of us, that temptation to see those who disagree with us as wicked, to dehumanize those we see as enemies. And it is a peril that we must remain ever vigilant against, lest we find ourselves one day in the place of the Inquisitor, so convinced of our own righteousness that we are blind to the suffering we inflict. In the end, perhaps the true lesson of the Inquisition is not just the depths of cruelty to which we can sink, but the capacity for self-deception and rationalization that lies within the human heart. It is a sobering reminder that even the most monstrous acts can be cloaked in the language of virtue, that even the most heinous abuses can be justified in the name of a supposedly greater good. And so, as we close this dark chapter in human history, let us reflect not only on the lives destroyed and the wrongs inflicted, but on the eternal vigilance required to prevent such horrors from happening again. Let us remember the Inquisitors not as demons, but as deeply flawed men, subject to the same weaknesses and temptations as any of us. And in so doing, perhaps we can learn to spot the seeds of intolerance and fanaticism within ourselves and uproot them before they have a chance to grow into something monstrous. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. I hope that even as this story has chilled and unsettled you, it has also sparked reflection and a renewed commitment to empathy, compassion, and standing firm against cruelty in all its guises. If you found this exploration of the Inquisition compelling, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more nuanced dives into complex historical events and figures. There are so many more stories to tell, many more shadows to shine a light into. I look forward to continuing this journey of discovery and reckoning together. For now, though, it is time for rest. Let the ghosts of the Inquisitors fade into the darkness of the past, secure in the knowledge that by facing and remembering their deeds, we take one more step toward ensuring they need never stalk our nightmares again. Until next time, dear viewer, sleep well.